Canadian inflation eased in April, but with the impact of tariffs beginning to be felt, what's ahead for the Bank of Canada and interest rates? Joining us now to discuss is Robert Both, Senior Macro Strategist with TD Securities. Robert, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be back.
All right, so we've got the inflation numbers out for April. What's your reaction?
So my reaction is that, headline inflation was more or less in line with our expectations. We saw a pretty large deceleration from 2.3% in March to 1.7% in April. But we and the market knew that inflation was going to slow. This was a foreseeable deceleration because we did see carbon taxes removed on April 1st of this year. So we saw smaller contributions from energy products, gasoline, natural gas, but we also saw a very large divergence to the Bank of Canada's preferred core inflation measures, which are designed to strip a lot of those more volatile components out. So the two that the bank looks at most closely, those are CPI trim and CPI median. Those not only did they not decelerate, they actually accelerated from about 2.85% to 3.15%. So that leaves core inflation running above the top of the Bank of Canada's target range. And just over the last 3 months, those core inflation measures are running closer to 3.5%. So you're seeing this divergence between headline and core. And while there are very clear drivers to the downside that explain that weakness in headline inflation, the core strength is a little bit harder to explain away, if you will.
Okay, so given that divergence between core and headline, are you seeing any signs of tariffs in the data?
We are seeing some early signs of tariffs, and one of the places where we would expect to see those first are in grocery prices. So on March 4th, Canada imposed tariffs on a number of grocery products. Included within that was things like orange juice, peanut butter, coffee and tea. These are all components that saw larger price increases in April. So, it wasn't a 25% adjustment on these individual products, but those price hikes did contribute to an acceleration in grocery prices. So groceries overall, inflation rose from about 3.2% to 3.8%. So that's well above where the Bank of Canada wants it, and that can put a lot more pressure on, some of those more vulnerable households where, groceries do take up more of the budget. So, we saw tariff impacts materialize there, but we're still not seeing it across many of the other goods components in the CPI basket.
So what's your outlook for inflation going forward? Do you expect some of that tariff bite to continue to show up in the data?
So we do expect to see more of that tariff bite over the next few months. Now, it's not going to, push inflation towards the top half of the 1% to 3% range. We think it's going to push inflation back closer to the middle of that range, but it is going to leave that large gap between headline and core in place. So over the next few months, we expect to see more on grocery prices, but we're also going to see more pressure on household goods, clothing, things of that nature.
So does this put the Bank of Canada in a tight bind? What's your outlook for the Bank of Canada and rates going forward?
So I think for the challenge for the Bank of Canada is really how do they reconcile this gap between headline and core inflation. Now, the bank knew that headline inflation was going to fall sharply lower. We heard them say just in their last press conference and policy decision that they looked for inflation to average about 1.5% over Q2. With today's report, headline inflation is still tracking closer to 1.7, and core inflation is tracking closer to 3.1 versus the 3% they had it. So inflation overall is a little bit stronger than the bank saw coming. And that sort of takes me back to December of 2024 when you had HST coming off. We hadn't seen that in the data yet. The Bank of Canada still came out and said at the December meeting that they looked for inflation to stabilize around 1.5% once that tax cut fed through. Now, we only got down to about 1.8% over Q4. But that didn't stop the BOC from easing rates. So we think that the bank can look through this stronger headline inflation. It's the core numbers that are going to pose a much larger challenge, especially with those 3-month rates of core above 3%. We think in that type of environment, the bank is really going to want to see more evidence of a slowdown in the activity data, and that is going to leave a brighter spotlight on both Q1 GDP and then the retail sales numbers we'll get towards the end of this week as well.